على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So people want to pull up the hadith. We're looking at hadith number 10 of the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. We've been looking at this for the last few weeks. Just as people are pulling it up, we talked in the first session on this hadith about the first part of the hadith that says, Inna Allah Tayyib, that indeed Allah is Tayyib. And what this means in terms of the context of Abu Huraira being the narrator of this hadith and him being introduced into the community at a latter part in the prophethood, in the Medinese era of revelation. And so the prophet's still talking about who God is to his companions, and they're still sharing this with others in terms of who Allah is. And this becomes a very integral part to Islam. Everything's very God-centric. So knowing who Allah is, we talked about the idea of embodying as best as we can the characteristics of the divine. So we have hadith that say, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, that embody the characteristics of the divine, that you have human capacity to, right? So we know Allah is good and Allah is merciful, so being merciful is good, right? Allah is just and Allah is good, so being just is good. Having compassion, having kindness, softness, gentleness, right? We talked about different ways we can engage this as well, reflecting on the names of Allah, seeing where they manifest in the world around us, them lives, and then as a fourth step, writing a dua in relation to that. So you're building a relationship with Allah, deepening in that by calling upon Allah as Ar-Rahman. And so, Ya Rahman, and then you write this dua out to Allah as Ar-Rahman, Ya Latif, Ya Wadud, and actually engaging in that. And then we talked for a good chunk of time on what does it mean in relation to the latter part of that first segment of the hadith, where Inna Allah Tayyib, La Yaqbalu illa Tayyiba, that he does not accept except that which is Tayyib, and how we can understand the notion of acceptance of an action. And then hadith number 1 and hadith number 5 in these 40 hadith, they give an insight into what are the components of an action being acceptable. So the first hadith, that actions are by their intentions, that inward component. And then hadith number 5 that talks about things being added to the religion being rejected. So the outward has to coincide with what is a part of the shari'ah in order for those two things to be a part of a deed that fits into those categories of actions that are acceptable. Yeah. So we're going to look a little bit now into the latter part of this hadith and the verses that are mentioned. But can somebody read the English and the Arabic? You can read either or. It doesn't have to be both and. Yeah, go ahead.
From the start?
Sure.
On the authority of Abu Hurairah, who reported that the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Indeed, Allah the Exalted is pure and accepts only that which is pure. Allah has commanded the believers to do what He commanded the messengers, and He, the Exalted, said, O messengers, eat of the good things and work righteous. And He, the Exalted, said, O you who believed, eat from the good things which we have provided you. Then He mentioned a man who has prolonged a journey, is disheveled and dusty, and extends his hands to the heaven, supplicating, O Lord, our Lord, our Lord, while his food is unlawful, his drink is unlawful, his clothing is unlawful, and he has been nourished by what is unlawful. So how could he be answered?
Great. Jazakallah khair. Can someone read the Arabic? Yeah, go ahead.
عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله طيب لا يقبل إلا طيبا وإن الله أمر المؤمنين بما أمر به المرسلين فقال تعالى يا أيها الرسل كلوا من الطيبات واعملوا صالحة. وقال تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم. ثم ذكر الرجل يطيل السفر أشعث أغبر يمد يديه إلى السماء يا رب يا رب، ومطعمه حرام ومشربه حرام وملبسه حرام وغذي بالحرام فأنى يستجاب له.
Jazakallah khair. So, as we're getting into now, the crux of this is giving a little bit more specificity. And there's going to be these two verses of the Quran that we're going to look at here. Understanding this now necessitates understanding the distinction between what is halal and what is tayyib. And we can understand principally what something is by understanding what it's not. So we've talked about the nature of something being tayyib as wholesome, something that is free of defects, deficiencies, and inadequacies, that if you had kind of a product at its, best composition, that would be something that's tayyib. I think a few weeks ago I gave the example of like mangoes, right? If you have like a really solid ripe mango versus one that's not good, the one that's in like the best form, that's the one that you would say is tayyib, like it's in its purest of form, it's wholesome of form. Does that make sense? Free of like deficiencies and inadequacies. In Arabic, one of the opposites of something that is tayyib, you would say, is from the khaba'ith, like it's unclean, it's impure, it has inadequacies, it's, lacking some of the things that we would understand wholesomeness to be. But we can also understand this in contrast now to what it is that exists from a legalistic framework, especially as we're going to get into extrapolating meaning from these two verses that the Prophet ﷺ shares in this hadith, before we get to the latter part in the next week or so, about this man who is embodying the characteristics of one who has like dua readily accepted. He's traveling, he's in a state where he's been exerting struggle, he's journeying, he's disheveled in these ways, his hands are raised to the skies. These are all things that are indicative. He's saying, Ya Rabbi, calling upon Allah in a way that individuals, when we read dua in the Quran, so many of these duas start with, Rabbana or Rabbi, right? Like these are etiquettes of dua that outwardly indicate something, but the latter is then demonstrating the inner that is rooted in food is haram, drink is haram, clothing is haram. But the juxtaposition of what's haram here to what is tayyib is nuanced from what is haram to what is halal, but contextually necessitates an extension of what is halal, given some of the challenging parameters that exist in a prism of modernity. So if we were to talk about what's the difference between these two things, like what are some of the things that we would say, right? Words have definitions, and we want to be able to understand them. If you look in a lot of classical fiqh books, they don't really talk about what the word tayyib means, because it's not a legal categorization. When we talk about the ahkam that we've spoken about before, the ahkam shari'ah, they're like a 5-value based categorization system that you have halal and haram at the end extremes, fard and haram rather, like the obligatory and what is strictly prohibited religiously. And if you take a step inward, you have what is makruh, what is disliked, and what is mustahab, what is recommended. And then in the middle, you have what's mubah, what's neutral. And then in the Hanafi school, they have a 7 categorization system. So makruh gets divided into makruh tahrimi, like makruh closer to what is haram, and makruh tanzihi, right? It's a little lesser degree of disliked. And then between fard and mustahab, they interject what's wajib or necessary. But just so we can kind of get going and have people kind of get situated a bit, if you can turn to the persons next to you right? If you've never been here before, you don't want to only say what you think is the right thing or kind of be in a place where you hesitate because you're worried about saying the wrong thing, but just so we can understand from each other's experiences. Like, what is the difference between what is halal and tayyib? And even if you never thought about it before, right? Like, what are the things that come to mind based off of what we talked about, what you might have understood from different individuals or conversations, things that you've read, just so we can start to build a relationship with the terminologies, and we'll distill it a little bit more, but also so people can kind of get talking a bit, so we're a little bit more kind of a part of the conversation. So what is the difference? Like halal and tayyib, how would we understand their application, what they mean? If you can talk about it for a couple of minutes with the persons next to you, and then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead. And we just ask people, maybe if you can move in a bit, you can also space out, but just so people have room to come in to pray. So if you guys can move in a little bit, that would be great.
Ultimate solution.
Okay, so what are some of the things that are coming up for people? Like, what's the difference between these two words, halal and tayyib? What do we discuss? Can you guys move in a bit so that people who are coming in to pray are not going to be praying in the corners, so we can just squeeze in this way? And if you see anybody that starts to pray near the doorways, if you can just tell them to come in so they're not blocking the doors. So what do we discuss? What do you think are some of the things that make these two terms different from one another? Yeah.
So I didn't know we were gonna do like a thought exercise, so I was Googling the word tayyib as you were talking about it, and it said something in its purest form. So I was thinking that halal is something that Allah commands us is what is right. And then I was kind of thinking about it in the context of food. Like you could have a zabiha meat, right? You could eat zabiha. However, the animal could be raised in bad conditions. It could be treated with antibiotics. So it might not be in its purest form, right? It might not be tayyib, even though it's zabiha. And that's what I kind of was trying to conceptualize. Not everything,
Yeah, makes sense. Other thoughts?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know I just got in, but based on my conversation with Dad, excuse me, could one eat something tayyib that is not halal? Or my
Well, we'll talk about that in like 5 minutes. Yeah, we're gonna probably focus a lot on that today. But what are some of the differences in the term? Yeah.
So if we were like talking about, I guess, halal, you would categorize it as like the passing threshold, and like tayyib is like, for example, we were talking about how like the passing grade could be like a C, and that's like the halal, like a C or a B, which is halal. But you want to aim for like an A, which is what the tayyib is. So it's like one is like the bare minimum, and the other one is like the what you should aim to do after having reached the threshold. So like, for example, when we were studying about the salah, I think it was like you have to read like one like verse of the Quran to satisfy the prayer, but then we also add extra stuff to like as part of to go be like beyond.
Well, that's a little different, but those are, yeah. But I get what you're saying. Yeah. Somebody had their hand raised in the back.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think for us, we simplified it to everything that's tayyib is halal, but not everything that's halal can be halal.
Great.
So the relationship that we need with the two.
Okay. Did everyone understand that? Yeah. So everything that's tayyib is halal, but not everything that's halal is tayyib. Does that sound accurate? Yeah. It might not be. Yeah. But we're going to talk about that also. Yeah, it sounds like it could be good, but it might not be. Yeah. So halal is a legalistic framework around permissibility from the standpoint of fiqh, right? So it's legal in its undertones, and something that's tayyib is qualitative. And so you can apply something being tayyib not just to food, right? And a lot of times when we think about halal, we think about it just in terms of food, which this hadith is also going to give us a lot of insight on. But, your tayyib, kind of the aspects of this from the first part of the hadith, in Allah tayyib la yaqbalu illa tayyiba. So indeed Allah is pure and he does not accept except that which is pure. So like all of your actions can be determined through this prism of tayyib, right? Your speech, the clothes that you wear, the notion of how you relate to other people, the qualifying term of being tayyib is not limited to just food or drink, but it's a quality that we can exert on a broader level. Here, when we're thinking about it, you have now these things that fundamentally should be applicable, but Islam is very much so rooted in the prism of reality. So when you're looking at fiqh books that talk about what's halal, they're going to talk about this through the prism of, things that we might have engagement with, because you don't have to know why you do what you do in order to do it. Like you don't need to understand the basis of it or the evidences of it or be able to explain like here in the Quran is where it is. Like you can just know you're not supposed to eat pork in order to not eat pork. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to say based off of this verse, I understand this, right? Like we just don't eat pork. Do you know? What renders something halal in terms of food is going to be what Allah is telling us. This is where this hadith is giving us this insight, right? Inna Allah amara al-mu'minina bima amara al-mursaleen, right? That Allah is commanding the believers with that which he commanded the mursaleen. Meaning the Prophet is telling his companions, you're doing the same things that we were told to do. Some of these commands, they are rooted in things that are applicable to all of us. And it's mu'mineen and not muslimin, because a lot of the legalistic framework is addressed now through these constructed verses, or rather these verses that have the initial construct of Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, that oh people of iman, because they're particular to people who are Muslim, meaning like people who are not Muslim, they don't follow Islam. So as the verses are being revealed, as things are growing, and there's now fiqh being derived from verses that have legalistic frames to them. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu are usually the verses that are attached to things that have to do with practices that Muslims do. So can you go into a pizza place and somebody's eating a pepperoni slice and slap it out of their hands and say, you can't eat that? No, they're not Muslim, right? This is not how it works. Do you know? Here now, we want to, though, think about some of these things as an entry point. So quite often we apply this to what is just about meats, but halal as a branch is applicable to all foods, right? And who's the one that determines something is halal? That the hadith is telling you, Inna Allah amara al-mu'mineen, that indeed Allah is the one that commands the people of Iman, right? Just like what? How he commands the mursaleen, the people of Risala, the prophets. So the basis of it is still God-centric. And who is the God that is establishing what is good? The God that is also Tayyib. Inna Allah Tayyib. That Allah is Tayyib. He is the source of all of this. So if anybody's going to know what it is that you should be consuming to fuel you, it's the one that made you in the first place. So it's not because your mother and father said to do this, or like the local imam said to do this, or there's a sign in the window that says do this, right? You do this because Allah said to do it. And the commands are not in a vacuum. But the implementation of shari'ah is meant to increase benefit and reduce detriment. And we think about permissibility in conjunction with what is tayyib. The two go hand in hand in the Quran again and again, because a lot of us are consuming garbage. And when we get to a place where there's no consciousness, there's no reflection in it, morality is not relative in Islam. It's not based off of what I think and I feel. And then morality also extends to everything. So you can have a moral compass in how you eat. Does that make sense? Like ethical consumption is a part of our tradition. Moral feeding of yourself, a morality to your consumption is also there. And you don't want to distill this to just what is most simplistic, that the Quran says don't drink or don't engage in intoxicants. Yes, that's a part of it, but the broader framework of it is going to be about, like, you're eating an animal that was stuck in a cage with 12 other animals. You're consuming its fear. It's being fed like body parts of its own species because people are absent of ethics. This notion of being tayyib in every facet is something that now, by extension, one would argue the utilization of this word tayyib is interjected a lot because what's permissible in and of itself does not denote what is ethical. Because people are creating a lot of things that can be permissible, but it doesn't mean by extension that that's the best thing for us to be engaged in consumption-wise. Does that make sense? So we think about this in terms of like fruits and vegetables. You could eat all of it. There's some different opinions categorically on seafood. Like some would say certain types of things that exist in the sea, crabs, etc., they can exist on land. It's a little bit more distinct. And others would say all seafood is fine, right? And then you get into things that are like dead already. The carcass of an animal you can't eat, for example, right? All these kinds of things. And we can have a separate conversation on that. In relation to slaughtering practices, when somebody says the word dhabiha, essentially the slaughtering mechanism is done in a few different ways. One, you have a broader understanding that says that the name of God has to be uttered at the slaughter. The slaughterer has to be someone who is a believer in that God. And the slaughter has to be done individual to the jugular at a horizontal. So it's cutting 4 of the main arteries and creating a cessation as immediately as possible so that the animal is not feeling pain and that it's being bled out fully. Why are there people who wouldn't do this? Well, to give you an idea, right? Just on this simple thing. Like in our tradition, it's bled out fully. I used to own a butchery up the street, right? Called Honest Chop. Some of you may know or may not know. And I used to own a restaurant over there. I don't own it anymore. I mean, I still own it, but we don't have the stores open. We closed that one shortly after COVID. The street just got really grimy. There's a lot of robberies. People were getting assaulted. And the demographic that was coming to our restaurant was a little distinct from the other stores that were open at that time. The comedy clubs aside, it was mostly the bars. They'd open a bunch of marijuana stores. You could picture like an auntie coming from Long Island to eat a burger in the midst of all of this. And there was increased crime at that time, right? And so we made the decision for the safety of our staff and the safety of our customers. It just didn't make any sense. And then our butchery, the lease ended over there at the end of October of last year. When we saw escalated violence in Gaza, may Allah grant them ease and end the occupation that's taken place there. Just didn't make any sense at that time for me to be focused on business ventures when there was so much else going on in the community. Why some people don't want a product that the blood is removed fully is because you got a lot of blood in your body, right? Right? So think about a cow that's much bigger than you. How much blood does a cow have in its body? Like a lot of blood. Do you know? And so if you talk to someone who's devoid of ethics, they're thinking about wealth alone. They're not going to be anti-halal practices because they are against Sharia. But if you start letting the animal bleed out fully, it weighs less. And when it weighs less, that means that you are charging like per pound, and then you get less from it, right? So they don't care about what you're eating. They want to care at every level how they can maximize on the profitability. You can think about that as a good or a bad, but it's a thing, and it's there. There's some distinctions that people will make from a vertical slaughter to a horizontal. Allah knows best. We could talk about that separately. And then by extension, some people would allow for the consumption of what is kosher and what is from people of the book. There's different opinions because in kashrut, you don't have to utter the tasmiyah prior to every slaughter, right? We say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. And there are different opinions within Sharia that every individual animal that's slaughtered needs to have the prayer uttered over it, or can there be some that it was left out or forgotten? And in Jewish law, it's valid if it's left out or forgotten on occasion. Not every school of thought says that within Sharia. Does that make sense? And then the verse that people use as a basis says to not consume that has other than the name of God uttered over it. So some people will say, if something had nothing uttered over it, then that suffices. So it becomes a basis, not because people are saying, oh, it's a Christian country, so I could eat anything that's there. That doesn't make any sense because, and I'm not saying this other than objectively, because you're basing it off of the slaughterer, not like the prevailing norm of the country. Like if you went to Pakistan, that is the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and there was a Hindu guy that slaughtered the chicken, you can't say, well, it's a predominantly Muslim country. The Hindu guy slaughtered the chicken. It doesn't work, right? So the default isn't that if the predominant religion culturally is Christianity, that the person doing the slaughter is going to be a Christian or a Jew or a believing Christian or Jew. Do you know? Does that make sense? So what many are basing it off of is that if other than the name of God has not been uttered, then it's still permissible. Meaning if nothing was uttered over it, that makes it okay. Because if nothing was uttered, it doesn't mean that other than the name of God was uttered. Does that make sense? Right? we're not going to debate which is what, but they are diverse opinions that exist within the prism of halal. And you just have to tolerate that. You can follow what you follow, but if your life mission is to get someone else to buy into this, you're not necessarily really understanding the point of all of it. Do you know what I mean? It's an evidentiary-based system. If somebody has an evidence that is the basis as to why they're going to go eat something that you might not eat, they still have a basis to it. Does that make sense? Don't trivialize your Islam to this. There's bases. But also, don't let your stomach be what it is that's defining the decision, right? So just because it tastes good doesn't mean that metaphysically is going to render benefit for you. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense so far? Right, and now in kind of a modern time, you have conversations around machine slaughtered versus hand slaughtered. What we have on our campus is all hand slaughtered, local, like food. We adopt that opinion aside from personal preference. So it allows for everybody to eat it, right? When you have a community that's as diverse as ours. So if you went to the dining hall at NYU and it was only serving like categorically something that people were comfortable with, that, you know, for machine slaughter, for example, then the hand slaughter people wouldn't eat it. But the machine slaughter people will eat what's hand slaughtered. Does that make sense? Right? Do you get what I mean? Right? So it's very broad. And when people say, well, why can't we just create halal certifications? When kosher as an industry was established, they were just suing a lot of people to ensure that what's kosher was like labeled well. You have to do your due diligence to know what it is that you're putting into your body. And that's what this hadith is fundamentally telling us, right? That you want to be conscious of what you're consuming. And so now the halal, what's permissible, is there in a legal consideration. Qualitatively now, Tayyib is introduced more so within recent times because there's so much stuff that's being put into things that is just really terrible, both for you to consume as well as for the animal, but also more broadly across the board. Like people, the clothes that you wear, right? If it's wrong to mistreat people in sweatshops, right? It's wrong to mistreat also the animals who aren't being like cared for well. And so the extension gets added on, but it's not discussed as much as one would think about in books that were written centuries ago, because centuries ago, nobody was pumping steroids into animals. Nobody was putting antibiotics into animals, right? People didn't even eat a lot of meat. And they were in places where even like fruits and vegetables and these kinds of things weren't coated with a lot of stuff that unconsciously when you're consuming, or there's an absence of ethics to consumption or an absence of morality to consumption, the stomach is what's just fundamentally making the decision. I'm eating it because I like it, right? I'm eating it because I want it. But that's just not how this tradition functions. Like that's not enough of a reason to engage in that as a practice. Does that make sense? And so when you extend this now, you start to look at different things. Like how can we attach what is tayyib to consumption? And you got to think about it deeply. So you're not just thinking about it in the sense of like, oh, I went to Khalid's restaurant and they're serving organic halal meat that's hand slaughtered. It checks off every box. That's not all of what tayyib can be applied to in the entirety of a supply chain. Do you get what I mean? But also from everything that goes into what that meal is about. Do you get what I'm saying? So what I'd like for us to do is just turn to the person next to you. The word tayyib now, it's a qualifying term, not a legalistic term. What are the different things that it could be applied to when you're talking just about eating? And eating both in your home as well as eating outside of your home. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we can talk about it to the persons next to you. What's all the stuff that I could use the word tayyib to start to define and qualify, right? And ideally you talk in pairs, but maybe no more than 3 so everyone's talking. And then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
Oh yeah, me too. I've been like scribbling down.
I'll see you. Good luck. It's okay, you can abandon us.
I promise I work.
Yeah.
Apart from like Okay, so what are some of the things? What can you apply this word tayyib to? So you're not just thinking about it when you're eating at the restaurant and it's sitting on a plate in front of you, right? Like what is elsewhere that this word can be interjected? Yeah.
We were talking about how, like the appreciation of food, because it's like you don't want to be eating stuff just like thinking with your stomach or like whatever. It's like mindfulness in all aspects of like the idea of eating. So it's like it's including like the people you're surrounding yourself with. Make sure you're surrounding yourself with people who are also appreciative of the food, and you yourself, like while you're eating, be appreciative of like what you have.
Yeah, great. Right? We have hadith. Companions come to the Prophet. We eat. We're not full. And the Prophet ﷺ says, perhaps you eat by yourselves. And they say, yes, we do. And he says, eat together and mention the name of the divine over which you eat. Right? There'll be more barakah in this. Right? Food for one is enough for two. Food for two is enough for four. Right? Barakah, if we define it, is the ability to do more with less. Do you know? So like eat with these people. Are they like strangers, the people you should be eating with? You know, do you want to eat? Like I could go into a restaurant and throw down a bunch of cash. And there's a lot of people around me, but is there barakah in that? Do you see what I mean? Right? So who are the people? And like, think about hadith in connection to each other. The Prophet ﷺ says, you know, in defining walimas, wedding receptions, that, you know, there's wedding receptions, he says, that like people who are invited are the ones who should not have been invited, right? And the people who should have been invited, they were the ones left out. You got a lot of friends who are idiots, do you know? Or you got people in your community that all they do is talk poorly about you, right? So you're constantly in this place where like there's people who gossip, there's people who they have nothing better to do other than like speak poorly of you. Why are you inviting them to celebrate your wedding with you? Don't make your kids, when you have blessed to have children, like have the supposed to's based off of societal answers, because it's about social prestige that so-and-so had to be. And then we didn't invite this person because they're not of our culture. They're not of our race. They're not of our skin color, right? But then you are left out from barakah. Do you see what I mean? It's not my words. It's the Prophet's words. The wedding feast, the walima, the ones that are good and the ones that are bad. What's the categorization based off of? You invited people who you shouldn't, and you left out the ones who you should. Do you see? But the gatherings are a product of the people who are in them. What else can Tayyib be a part of? Yeah.
So like in terms like we've already like discussed meat, but like for example when it comes to like I guess maybe fruit or vegetables, we could talk about like the labor, the treatment of the labor who are actually going out into the fields. Like some of them are abused, made to like work in the sun, are being paid very little, and like they're just like making people richer. So but
yeah, and then what also happens consequently if that happens? Aside from the fact that it's terrible to mistreat someone, right? Like our tradition teaches us, you pay your employee before the sweat from their brow hits the ground, right? The laborer is honored in every which way. Do you know? But also, if you have to make it self-serving, that person is picking food as they're likely griping and cursing and being agitated. It's going into the process. You walk into a restaurant where people are treating people terribly. My son and I in COVID went into a cupcake store, and I've owned a bunch of businesses, right? But I'm not like a businessman. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe I am, I don't know. But I walked in and there was one guy working behind this in the pandemic. And we got these cupcakes. We were going to a friend's house and we wanted to get them something. And my son and I were sitting there talking to this guy. And I said to him, how long have you been working? He didn't even have a chair. He was standing behind the counter. And he said, I'm the only one that's been working. And the store was open at that point for probably 7 hours. And so my son was maybe 6 at this time. And I said to this guy working behind the desk, like, when do you go to the bathroom? He said, I haven't been able to go to the bathroom. And I said, hey man, go to the bathroom. I'll stand here. And he went. And then he came back and he came across the counter and he gave me a hug. And then we left and my son said, Baba, why did that man hug you? Is he your friend? And I said, no, Kareem. And I explained to him, I own a restaurant. Even when we weren't making a lot of money in COVID, there wasn't times when just one person was doing everything. How will that person eat? How will they go to the bathroom? Do you understand? And then what's going to happen? You're going to buy those cupcakes and that person's sitting there alone, griping, and all of the cursing is going into the food at a metaphysical level. You could have a whole team working and they're getting paid nothing. We had a guy who was an asylum seeker. His family was killed in targeted killings of Shia Muslims in Pakistan. He came here with a lawyer and a social worker, was worried to come into the building because they had told us he was Shia. And he was used to pretending that he was Sunni. And now he thought, they know I'm not Sunni, something will happen. Why would he not think that? This is what happened to his family. May Allah grant them peace. And so we had some conversations. I told Sheikh Fiaz to come down and talk to him. He eased things for him a little bit. And then later on, I was in communication with him a little bit more. He was working at a fast food restaurant under the table. They paid him $2 an hour in cash. How can you function off of $2 an hour in cash living in any of the boroughs in New York City? But for the purposes of this conversation, is that tayyib? Do you think it impacts the food in some way? The answer is yes, it does. What else? What else do you apply it to? The word tayyib, yeah.
I guess with what you said, running a business, like it should be like fair and like everything should be just. Or else, like even if like you're making money from the business being like unjust, it won't really like be in your favor like in the afterlife.
Yeah, 100%. Like, how much money is it worth going to hell for? All these people are going to stand on the day of judgment, right? That guy was deepening his pockets on the sweat of my back and did not give me anything that was even considered to be livable. Do you know what I mean? Right? But what makes it tayyib? Inna Allah tayyib la yaqbalu illa tayyibah. And then you're consuming this stuff. The treatment of the animals becomes terrible. The treatment of the employees becomes terrible. The treatment of everything is mass produced because people have manipulated in a consumer-driven society to give you the idea that just because you want it, you're entitled to have it. Fasting is a regular practice for us, mandated for 30 days, not so you just control the quantity of it, but you start to be conscious of your ability to be conscious. You are now in a place where the day after Ramadan is done, on the day of Eid, when you put food in your mouth for the first time, you feel weird putting it in your mouth. And everyone is so weird, I'm eating during the day. It's not weird. Shaitan is tricking you. What you're actually experiencing is mindfulness to your eating. You are, for the first time, consequently dealing with what the outcome is supposed to be of fasting, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you might perhaps attain taqwa. And then every part of you gets watered down by it so that you don't feel weird eating anymore. Should I be eating this right now? Is this the best thing for me to put into my body? But I go from not starvation, conscious consumption, to then just rolling into it as if none of it even happened. And then we're the only animals that even after our stomach is full, we keep feeding ourselves. Do you ever see lions just kill animals for the sake of it? They don't. They don't walk around, I'm a lion, I'm going to kill you, right? That's just not how it goes. But you know, right? Some of us in this room, we know it, that you eat even when you're not hungry. This is how people make money off of you. And they're driven by wealth acquisition that is not tayyib. And if every part of this lacks it, then this first verse is what you want to reflect upon. Can somebody read the first verse? Ya ayyuha rusul, kulu min tayyibat. What does it say? After it says eat from what is tayyib, what does it say at the end of it? It's not, somebody want to read it? Do you have it in front of you?
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on, but somebody just read the thing. What does it say? It's not a trick question.
يا أيها الرسول كلوا من الطيبات واعملوا صالحا.
Right. That you eat what is pure, and then your amal, do it, and it is salih. It is righteous. So there's a connection between these two things. If you don't eat what's pure, then the act is not going to be something that is a righteous act. And who's being told this? The messengers. So, hey, you are the messengers of God. Eat what is tayyib, and then go do what is righteous. So sometimes when we're trying to figure out, why am I not able to get it done? Why is it hard for me to go and complete the task? everybody else seems to be doing well, and everybody else is not. Everyone's got lots of stuff going on. Allah make it easy for all of us. But I can't fast. Why is it hard? I find difficulty in reading Quran. Why do I gossip so much? Why am I engaged in lying? One of the potential avenues you want to explore is maybe you're not eating what's tayyib. Your consumption is of things that are impure. You can take things in through all organs of sensory perception, right? You want to be a being that doesn't just simply hear but listens. You don't want to just see, you want to perceive. You don't want to just touch, you want to feel. And you move from simply eating to tasting. There's a lot of different ways that we can deepen in perspective, but you have sensory perception that is categorically things that also lend towards consumption. But here in particular is talking about what you eat. If you think about what's on the plates that you're eating right now, the ba and bismillah, when we say bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The ba and bismillah means a lot of different things. But one of the things that the ba means grammatically is it's meant to invoke within us an appreciation because it understands everything that is the egg that's on my plate had to go through in order for it to get to my plate. All of these people that had to move so you could have some cream cheese and peanut butter. And you think about it from its entire mode of progression. How much of what you're eating has people being paid unfair wages? How is it not going to impact your heart, man? How many people are standing on their feet, working shifts that 10 people should be working, and it's 2 people working the shifts? Because they don't have a choice. They live in a city where people want to introduce surge protection, increase prices, and $15 an hour jobs, having to pay $15 more to come in and out of parts of the city. That's 2 hours of a day of a person working a minimum wage job. If it's not a believer that's thinking about these things, who else would be thinking about them? That's where you can't stop your Islam at just praying and prostrating. The whole idea is that this is meant to inform what you do outside of this space. And just think about it. Think about what people will go through, what animals go through, what the land goes through, right? For you to get a bottle of water that's coming all the way from like New Zealand, right? How much like toxic fumes are being put in the air for you to get that bottle of water? You could get some water similar to that from someplace in America. You could, But what's feeding you? Like your ego. Why do I have to wear like these fancy brands? Why do I have to drink this thing that necessitated all of this other garbage being put into the environment and the atmosphere? Tayyib is applied to climate change. It is, whether you want to admit it or not. I owned a butchery. I know the farms that the cows came from. They were grass-fed, organic. They were allowed to be cows. I saw chickens, man, because we were trying to build these businesses as ways to generate revenue to build out social services in the community. The 10 years since we opened that butchery, alhamdulillah, we've been able to raise a lot more money organically, charitably, right? It's a beautiful thing. You are part of a community that's known as a generous community. That's amazing because a lot of communities are known just by their race and their culture, right? You're known as a generous community, right? And you want to be in a place where you make dua that Allah enables this space to continue to be filled with people who allow for us to be known in these ways. Do you know? We were going to do research. There was no halal meat store in all of Manhattan. So I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And we looked at what was halal, and it was clearly not tayyib. I met butchers who would throw all kinds of vinegar upon meat to give it the kind of facade that it was still good when it was not good. We interviewed butchers who worked in stores where they marinated pork and sold it as veal. We were meeting people, but why don't you know what you eat? Think about it. What is it that's educating you and informing you? And here in this verse, there's a direct connection between action and what you consume. Amal is different from fa'il. We said this when we looked at hadith number 1, right? A fa'il is something that's done unconsciously, and there's actions that need to be that. What would you do if you had to consciously think of every breath that you breathe into the world? I'm going to breathe now, I'm going to breathe now, I'm going to breathe now. It's a mercy from Allah. And there's people, may Allah grant them ease and shifa, they can't breathe on their own. What if you had to think every time you blinked your eyes, right? Now I'm going to blink. You couldn't do anything other than blink and breathe all day, right? It's a rahmah that this happens unconsciously. The amal is done with consciousness. So the language is important. Eat that which is tayyib and then do more acts consciously. Have you ever eaten so much that you can't think anymore? Right? You ever eaten so much you just gotta go to sleep? I got the itis. Oh man. You know, it happens. But understanding it from the prism of how these things get connected and where it's supposed to be different for us because we profess to be people of Iman. May Allah deepen us in our Iman. I saw chickens that had no feathers under their bodies because they were so pumped with steroids to inflate particular parts of their bodies that they never moved their entire life. So if you've ever had like a baby in your life and when it can't move and it's laying on the back of its head, hair grows everywhere other than in the spot where the head is always on the pillow, right? That's what's happening to these chickens. They got no feathers because they're just laying on the ground the whole time. And they're sleeping, eating, going to the bathroom in the same place. You're eating this. When animals are not honored and they're stricken with fear, they can hear the screeches of other animals being slaughtered in front of them. What do you feel like when you're afraid? All of that is running through their body. It's in their muscles. You're eating this. How would it not have an impact on you? And so when somebody says, well, can something be tayyib and not halal? It depends on what definition of halal you're adopting. But you can go to Whole Foods and probably get something organic if that's like what you're looking at, but it doesn't mean it was slaughtered properly. But in understanding also the other facets of what it is that we're buying into this, there's a connection point here that you cannot undermine, right? That what you consume will have an impact on everything else that is your output. And so if you are watching haram, you are listening to haram, you are eating haram, just like we can say that what is halal is likely tayyib, but all things that are halal aren't, wait, I said it wrong. We can say what's tayyib is likely halal, right? Allah knows best. But all things that are halal are not tayyib. We could probably, as we're trying to figure out if those are actual statements that are valid, definitely say though, like what's haram is never tayyib, right? And that's why the latter part of this hadith utilizes the term haram. So if you're in a place now where what you're consuming is not tayyib, and there's a good chance then that it's either borderlining on what is like permissible and impermissible, you don't want to do wrong by your heart by just saying, well, it's permissible, so it's good for me. Because that's just not the case anymore. You could have something that's like as clean fed as possible, but the people who are raising these animals are mistreated. Why would you want to be contributing to this? And how would it not impact actions? Because it necessitates mindfulness in actions to then prevent yourself from eating something that has a supply chain where anyone's rights are being dishonored. So it's going to bear continuity that there's then that much more in terms of output that is pleasing to the divine. Inna Allaha tayyib la yaqbalu illa tayyiba. Does that make sense? So I want you to think about just for a minute like, what do you base your consumption habits off of? Because a lot of people have taught us different things, right? And what informs my eating habits? Like, why do I eat what I eat to begin with? Does the question make sense? So you can turn to the person next to you, like, how did I learn what it is that I should be putting in my body in the first place? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? And then second, like, this connection point of how what we consume bears impact on our actions. What does that bring up for you? What does it make you think about? The idea of what I'm consuming, putting into me, is going to impact what comes out from me. Do you see what I mean? If we can talk about these two things, then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
I guess like before I didn't when I'm like going to dates, like yeah, I'm about to date. I don't
You can be mindful of
Okay. Shh. So what are some of the things we're talking about? What's coming up for people? What are we discussing? Yeah.
We're talking about it's the mind the second part of the question, which was how does eating things that are tayyib translate to your actions?
Yeah.
And it's like a connection that was kind of formed was like you don't want to put a limit on your you don't want to set a limit for yourself. So it's like you don't want to set a limit of like halal shouldn't be enough. It's like that's like setting a limit. We kind of use like the entire Islamic journey as an example. It's like why would you stop at 5 prayers when you can pray more? There's options to pray more. It's like you're setting a limit to how close you can get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's like why stop at halal when you can eat things that are more? It's like why stop at simply feeding one person? You can feed more people. It goes back to like capacity and all of that. It's like coming up with justification for your actions. It's like, okay, I'm in the capacity to eat. Like if all I have to do is look at a little bit more into what I'm eating, and I'm able to be, and it's like that much of a difference, you know. So.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
We talked about like the importance of being mindful when it comes to like being tayyib and being halal. So when you say stuff like bismillah before you eat something, you're not saying it just out of habit, but because you actually know what it represents, and like what you were saying before. And we also talked about like again like the proactiveness of knowing why you eat halal, why you're trying to be closer to tayyib, and as well as being proactive about these things and doing it through a lens of being mindful about why you're doing it in the first place, how important that is, and how much easier it makes it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think about like how following is about like shaping yourself to be a lot like what God intends you, who God intends you to be, but also shaping society in that way as well. Because I think about the example that you shared. Another way, like if more people can recognize like how unjust it is for that person to be working there and never buy from that cupcake shop, then it would shut down. And it would force people to recognize better practices. The same way, the more we are influenced by Tayyib, we can shape the world to be more as Allah intended it to be. By always, being attracted to things that are pure.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
We talked about how like culture sometimes affects us from doing those negative acts. For example, like I grew up in Pakistan, and some of the stuff we're gonna eat for breakfast is so unhealthy. And even in some of the gatherings we go to, there's the norm of making these like multiple dishes. And what ends up happening is that some of it goes to waste, which is not so good, right? Because like people in the world that are dying of hunger, and then you'll see these gatherings where there's food being listed. So it's not a good thing at all.
Yeah.
So we were also talking about like how like going off of the Bismillah component, where a lot of our communities, how they really like endorse this sort of like capitalist nature of like, really consuming a lot and completely disregarding like the metaphysical component of what it means to not only take in pure things, but also understanding how these pure things affect our soul, which goes back to what you were saying in reference to. Then that infuses into how I speak. It infuses into what I listen to. It infuses even my body language in reference to people, right? Because if I'm taking in pure things, then I'm going to be closer to acting like a pure being, which then, like we know that it's sunnah to even smile to people, right? Like it's an act of charity. And who says that if we're not taking in a lot of pure things, we see how much people's like whole body language and like whole persona erodes in reference to it, right? Whether it be in reference to their language, how they are to their friends, maybe they go more into gossip and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you start like making connections now, right? Through reflection and contemplation. And it's tough, but you start to think what goes into our spiritual diets. We're taught that if you learn how to control your stomach, you can pretty much be in control of everything. Do you know? And these types of things might seem like, well, is it about like, foregoing every single thing? No, like you can eat sweet stuff, right? You can eat like meat. You can eat these things. The Prophet ﷺ wasn't a vegetarian. He didn't eat meat all the time also, right? But you start to look into these aspects of our text. There's a hadith in the Muwatta of Imam Malik where Umar radiallahu anh, he says, beware of consuming like essentially like red meat, right? It has the addictive characteristics of alcohol, he says. You just eat it like all the time. You eat meat all the time. My wife, when we got married, we put meat in everything when I was younger, like constantly. We ate dal with meat and spinach with meat. And she said to me, I've never heard of a person that eats dal, like lentils with meat. I was like, man, we put meat in everything, But that's just what we ate growing up, right? It has like a residual effect, You think about it, like the soda that you drink might taste good, but do you think it's tayyib? Do you know? And if it's not, like, why are you drinking it? But answering that question and the regularity, like what is defining your decisions? Are you in control of your stomach or is your stomach in control of you? Do you eat food that's made by hands that are attached to bodies that care about you? There's going to be more barakah in it. So my kids make something at home to eat and someone says like, oh, they made a cookie. Are you going to eat that? Like, yeah, I'm going to eat it because there's barakah in that cookie. Do you see? Right? It's a lot different than if I'm ODing every single night on like things that I'm buying from supermarkets that I should probably be boycotting to begin with. Do you get what I mean? And then there's indifference to it. You see a lot of global movements right now around ethical consumption as it relates to different things. But the consciousness that comes back to us is fundamentally, you can do whatever you want. You're just going to be asked about why you did it that way. So like, why did you support the clothing brand that is killing people in sweatshops in Bangladesh? Like, why? Factories are collapsing on people and you're buying stuff from those places? Do you know? Yeah.
I have a question. So when you take the concept of Tayyib and if you extrapolate it beyond just like what you eat or listen to, I'm just wondering like how far can you take it while maintaining a sense of integrity in like a modern society? Because like we all own iPhones, for example. I work in tech, for example. Like how far can you take it while maintaining a level of integrity and staying sane?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because everybody's a little bit different. Doesn't mean you go home tonight and throw away everything in your house, right? But being kind of reasonable, and if when we talked about the previous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, that which I have like forbidden, avoid, that which I've commanded you to do to the best of your ability. Do people remember this hadith that we talked about like just weeks ago? One of the things that we broke down in this gathering was, how do you know what your capacity is? And I think a lot of us don't know what our actual capacity is. Do you know? And that's something that you'd have to really think out and answer and ask like difficult questions about, why am I purchasing the things that I purchase? And then in this room, there's immense talent, and you get stifled by the same systems that tell you you have to buy these things in order for what? But there's enough both talent and skill as well as wealth that you could build your own stuff. I have not, look, a lot of you have known me for a long time, and most of you who come here, like most people who come here know me, right? So I'm the director of the center, alhamdulillah, I love it. If I can start all the businesses that we started, the restaurant was going into a franchise mode. Do you know? The only reason we stopped it, aside from the particular restaurant, the franchising, was I don't have the aspirations to be the CEO of a meat company. Do you know what I mean? I don't think that's what I was made to be. So I was just looking for people who wanted to do that. But if my partners and I could build something that had franchise interests, we interviewed people. Maybe we interviewed some of you too, and you applied for it. People from different parts of the world. We were just building with like a strategy and ihsan, and it didn't take away from stuff we were doing here, right? Nobody said to me like, Khalid, you're neglecting the community. If anything, we saw immense growth in different ways, right? And I'm saying that if I can do that and my training is not in like anything business oriented or entrepreneurial, we probably have a lot more people that can build things and then create jobs and have alternatives. The halal industry globally is valued at $2 trillion. That's not halal as a food, but like as a lifestyle, and there's so many people right now who are not Muslim that are building these things out. I know, because they call me constantly. Can you make this zakat eligible for us? No, like I can't, I'm not, or like, hey, we're gonna like launch this product. All they do is throw like an Arabic sounding word attached to it. And everyone's like, oh, look, it's got the halal sign. And then it must be great, right? But that's like what you're reliant upon. And there's a lot of people who are making millions of dollars off of your consumption habits. They're not even Muslim, because they're building in filling gaps that like some of you should be filling and be thinking about how you do those things. Do you know? But you can't build with consciousness if you're just letting the stomach be what decides things. Do you see what I mean? And that's like a personal question that you'd have to wrestle with. Should I be working for the company that I work for? Some of the answers might be no. Do you get what that might be a very real answer to the question that when I stand in front of God, how am I going to say that I use this talent in this way? Some of it might not be a problem, but you're not seeing a job as a means to something, or with intentionality, what does it bring? But fundamentally, like I couldn't tell you that you should or should not be doing in certain ways. It's just in thinking out, like with specificity, how am I determining those decisions? And if you can eat without thinking about it, you can consume anything without thinking about it. And step number one is just bringing thoughtfulness to the process. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? If anybody wants to talk out any of these things specifically, we can figure those things out one-on-one. It's more precious than just like doing a Google search, listening to a YouTube video of something that was recorded months prior in an audience that you weren't seated with. That's not how you can kind of engage in real life decision making. Do you know? But there's a difference between having to make a difficult decision with consciousness and making a difficult decision without consciousness, right? And a lot of us are just doing things without presence of mind. Do you know? And we're not thinking about things that have to necessarily exist in order for us to consume at the levels that we do. Do you see what I mean? right? It takes a lot of water to breed this many cows. It takes a lot of land to be able to breed this much cattle, right? It takes a lot that we're destroying the earth in order for us to fuel our eating habits currently. And then your spiritual heart is linked to your physical heart. So like a literal physical hard heart, it's not going to make it easy to have a spiritually soft heart. Do you know? So you're just eating things that are creating high levels of cholesterol and high levels of like all kinds of mess, you know? And I say it because like my family is like a brown South Asian family. And I've seen tons of people who are older than me die with all kinds of heart issues and like cholesterol issues and diabetes issues and whatever else. So they're not mindful of diets attached to consumption. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So the Prophet is saying that, oh, people of Iman, Allah is commanding you with what he commanded us. And he gives a verse that juxtaposes Ya ayyuhar rusul to Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu. And now you're both being told, eat that which is tayyib. Eat that which has purity to it. So what I would tell people to do, just between this week and next week, when you sit down to have your next meal, just think about what had to happen for you to have this. And where are the gaps? And why are there gaps, like purposefully? Like in a society that is anti-black, that's built upon erasure, it doesn't want you to think about the parts that are invisible to you. It wants you to think that somehow magically the eggs just got on the shelf in the supermarket, right? It's not fundamentally possible. Do you know? It wants you to think that the first time that you interacted with a piece of clothing was the only time that you have to think about it, and not everything that happened in order for it to get to that place. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do this really quickly for 2 minutes. Just turn to the person next to you. What are you taking away from the conversation thus far? And then we'll come back and just share a couple of things to close out. If anybody's fasting, you could break your fast. Maghrib came in. And we'll talk for a bit, and then we'll pray Maghrib in a little bit. Hey, can you grab me a date? Thanks, yeah. We'll be done in 2 minutes. They're gonna close the building at 9 o'clock either way, so it's fine. Okay, what are some of the things we're taking away? Maybe a few people, and then we'll wrap up. The building's gonna close at 9 today and not 10. So we just wanna make sure people have enough time to pray and get some food. So what are some of the things we're taking away from today? Yeah.
It's all coming back to the same point, like being conscious, being self-educated, and having that ability to know ourselves and also be able to ask questions and try to find the answer. And if not, then we don't have to participate in those activities, whether it's shopping or eating or whatever it is. So being conscious, being educated, or being willfully doing it can help us identify and eliminate that thing that we can follow our prophet's advice.
Yeah, and you just want to be mindful, right? You don't want to go home and cause a ruckus in your house. You know, I'm not going to do this. And also when you're mindful of how you speak to others, there's a mercy and we have different opinions in our tradition, right? So if you're the only Muslim in your family and you have to eat like food in your family's home and your parents are trying as best as they can to be supportive, and now they got to figure out like some of these things, they might not be in a place where you are not able to say no to like the chicken that they're giving to you, right? You're going in steps. So what might be applicable to you might not be applicable to somebody else for various reasons, right? But you're working at a pace that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other thoughts before we wrap up? So like you want to think about some of these things. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Going back to like what you were saying before, like being mindful of what you're consuming, not just like through your mouth, but through all senses, like what you like listen to, what gossip you engage in, whether like implicitly or explicitly, things like that. They all like control your, but they all have like a metaphysical influence on you and your actions and your Tayyib. So
yeah, right. So there's a connection also here, and just sit with it. If you are someone who has like challenges with patience, you have challenges in controlling your tongue, you know, you get upset easily, look at your diet. It's very much so attached to all of you. A lot of us like stress eat, right? When we're feeling bad, we eat to numb pain. We do things with food to respond to our emotional selves, right? Your spiritual self is intrinsically linked to the rest of you. Your mental wellness, I can't focus. I have trouble in concentrating in my prayer. I feel tired. Look at what you're eating. Look at your diet. Who do you eat with? And we'll talk about this next week, like the quantity, the quality, it's going to be varied. You don't want to have understandings of beauty that are rooted in supremacist systems that are built to make you hate yourself. All of you are beautiful, right? You want wellness practices to be about holistic wellness and to not think about these things in ways that render now kind of, skewed understandings of the self that are then just creating circularity to the problem, right? Like I have to hate myself other than if I fit into this like rigid box of what beauty is. They're like, no, man, like let people be in a place where they seek to manipulate. You know you're beautiful because Allah said he made you beautiful, right? And in his wisdom, he made us into all the shapes and sizes that we are. Do you get what I mean? But just start thinking about it. Like, why am I putting this in? And there's certain things we can do with such ease mindlessly, do you know? And eating is one of those things. And it then creates a lot of challenges to the rest of us. And it's a hard conversation. So be kind to yourself in the process, right? Like, oh man, maybe like my mood is attached to like all this garbage that I'm eating, right? Or all this stuff that I'm watching, or all this stuff that I'm like listening to, do you know? And the Tayyib is important. And you know, it's true. If somebody like yelled at you all the time, would that be something that rendered upliftment? No. So what's the equivalent of that vis-a-vis your stomach, right? If you can hear things that are just like corrupt going in your ears, like what's the equivalent of what you're doing to your physical body through what you're eating and what you're drinking? And it's hard, right? Because like what can Muslims do when they hang out other than eat together? Do you know what I mean? But like deepen in that a little bit, do you know? And so make sure like what you're doing, you're smart about the businesses you support. Because like a lot of these people, they're not washing their hands after they touch pork and they touch something else. And you might think they are, but why would they do that? If they're getting paid nothing and they're also being treated terribly, you think, you know, and it's not to be gross, like don't be grossed out about it, but think about it in terms of this objective fact, right? They don't have a system of ethics that teaches tahara. So why are there signs needed in restaurants that say wash your hands before you leave? Because most people don't wash their hands. And then you're paying somebody $45 to eat something that likely was made with hands that weren't cleaned after they went to the bathroom. And you don't think it's going to impact your spirituality? Do you know? Right? And just in case people don't come next week, it's also okay to cook for yourself and like prep in advance, right? Imam al-Haddad, rahimahullah, when we look at the Book of Assistance, he talks about the awrad, like time management is self-management. You got to care about yourself enough that you're being present in spaces where there's barakah in the gatherings and you eat the food that's here, right? So whether you're eating like bread or you're eating pizza, there's barakah because the hands that brought the food here, we love each other. You know, that's an important part to this. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? And you start like prepping, get up for Fajr, and then you'll have extra time to like make a meal for breakfast for yourself. So you don't have to run and eat a donut that like you don't want to know what's in these things. Do you know? But you should. Okay, let's take a pause here. We're gonna have all the rest of our halakas this week. On Friday, Dr. Haifa Yunus is going to be here for a sisters only event. It's sold out, but if there's tickets that become available, we're going to send out messages to people who already got tickets. And if they can't show up, we'll let people know. And on Saturday, we're going to do our spiritual seclusion events that we're doing with Sam. So we did one in Central Park, and then there was a hike after that. This Saturday is going to be a halakha on a beach. I don't remember which beach, but I think the email went out. Which one? Jacob Reese. Yeah, there you go. So come to it. It's really nice, and we'll be outside on the beach towards the evening time, so it won't be too hot, inshallah. But people want to put their chairs against the wall. We'll call the adhan for Maghrib, and then please help us finish the food. And then we have to be out of the building by 9, so people can start trickling out around 8:50. That would be great.